Hey y'all, we've all seen iceberg charts. Whether it's for music, video games, countries, world leaders, we're all familiar with them. I thought that in today's video, I'd go over an iceberg explaining certain things that happened in Canada. I managed to find one on Reddit and I'll be explaining it in this video. All credit goes to u/throwaway129831237 for creating this iceberg. I'll be going over each entry on the iceberg, trying my best to be as descriptive as possible and giving the best explanation. I just want to make a quick disclaimer before the video starts that the different tiers contain disturbing content. This and the warning in the beginning are the only disclaimers you'll get. So if you ignore these and end up hearing something you don't like or that you found triggering, don't come complaining to me in the comments because I told you to expect these things in a video. Anyways, without further ado, let's start analyzing this iceberg. SNC Lavalin. SNC Lavalin refers to a scandal of the same name that unfolded in Canada in early 2019. It was when SNC Lavalin, an engineering and construction industry, was faced with legal challenges related to corruption, bribery, and fraud. Current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau involved himself during the scandal when he and the current Liberal government pressured then Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould to interfere in the SNC Lavalin case. The scandal engulfed the Canadian government and led to the resignation of key cabinet members, most notably the Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould, who also testified against the Prime Minister and exposed government corruption and how the government pressured her to pursue a settlement instead of a criminal prosecution. The affair became a large part of the 2019 federal election and also diminished a good image of the Trudeau government. PPC. The PPC refers to the People's Party of Canada, a right-wing political party created in 2017 by former Conservative Party cabinet minister Maxime Bernier shortly after he lost the 2017 Conservative leadership race. Officially, it started as a protest party against the Conservatives, but in recent times the party gained popularity after Bernier stood against COVID lockdowns, vaccines, immigration, and you get the idea. The party is surrounded in controversy and has had members linked to white supremacy and neo-Nazi groups. As of today, the party holds no seats in parliament, is still led by Maxime Bernier, but has lost popularity compared to its peak in the 2021 federal election. We Scandal. The We Scandal is another one of current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's scandals. It unfolded in 2020 when the government introduced the Canada Student Services Grant, a program aimed at helping post-secondary students financially and to gain work experience and volunteering experience during the summer. Problems arose when the government gave the We charity a contract to administer the program, and it was also found out that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and former Finance Minister Bill Morneau both had family members working for the charity, hence why they favored it. This led the Ethics Commissioner to launch an investigation to see if ethics rules were violated, leading to more investigations related to the process of giving the contract to We. Because of this, Finance Minister Morneau resigned in August 2020, and Justin Trudeau and his government faced further damage to their reputations. Because of the controversy and investigations, We pulled out of the contract deal, and the CSSG program was cancelled altogether in July 2020. Caillou. Caillou is a Canadian kids show that aired from 1997 to 2010. It followed the adventures of a 4-year-old boy with his family and friends. Early episodes had a specific theme and had several puppet skits, animation bits, and videos of live-action children in real-life situations. The later episodes dropped the real-life and puppet skits and focused more on animation. Many people hated the show because of Caillou being a spoiled, whiny brat whose parents always cave into him and blamed him for inspiring kids to be sociopaths. As of 2023, there have been plans for a reboot of the show. Canadian-Saudi weapons trade. This entry refers to the export of military equipment and weapons from Canada to Saudi Arabia. The deal was signed in 2014 and has been in effect ever since. There's a ton of controversy surrounding this, especially because Saudi Arabia is known for its numerous human rights violations and for having an authoritarian government. In 2018, the controversy of the trade agreement escalated when it was revealed that LAVs made in Canada were used by the Saudi Arabian military to crack down on dissidents, including in the eastern province where the minority Shia community resides. In 2018, the federal government faced pressure regarding the trade deal, but as of today, the weapon trade deal is still active. Jan Ghomeshi. This entry refers to Jan Ghomeshi, a British Persian-Canadian broadcaster who used to host a popular CBC radio program, Q. In October 2014, Ghomeshi was fired by the CBC following allegations of sexual assault and harassment. At first, Ghomeshi claimed he was dismissed from the CBC due to his BDSM lifestyle and asserted his sexual encounters were consensual. However, as more and more women came forward with accusations, the incident quickly evolved into a broader discussion about workplace harassment. Several women accused Ghomeshi of non-consensual physical violence during intimate encounters, describing Ghomeshi as being violent and that he'd choke, slap, and punch them without their consent. These accusations led to a criminal investigation by the Toronto Police Service, resulting in Ghomeshi being on trial for multiple charges, including 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of overcoming resistance by choking. However, he was acquitted on all charges in March 2016. The trial focused heavily on issues of consent and the credibility of witnesses and highlighted the challenges faced by survivors of sexual assault in the legal system. 1995 referendum. The 1995 referendum refers to the 1995 1895 Quebec independence referendum. It occurred after there was a new independence and nationalist sentiment among Quebecers during the 1990s. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Canada went through a series of reforms and decentralization attempts, all of which resulted in Quebec feeling as if English Canada rejected Quebec's interests. Because of this, a bunch of politicians formed the Bloc Québécois, a Quebec sovereignty party that was elected en masse to the federal Canadian Parliament. The popularity of the Bloc Québécois saw pro-independence politicians be elected to the Quebec provincial parliament, which resulted in an independence referendum being held. The referendum was extremely close, as only 50.58% of Quebecers voted to remain in Canada. Ever since then, Quebec nationalism and sovereignty movements have slowly died down, but Quebec has been granted special privileges that give it much more autonomy than other Canadian provinces and territories. Angela Anaconda. Angela Anaconda was a really strange Canadian kids show. It ran from 1999 to 2001 for a total of 65 episodes. The show focused on the adventures of an 8-year-old girl named Angela in the fictional town of Tapwater Springs. The show stood out for its strange animation and was hated because people found the main character Angela really annoying.
On account of you needing to hear about this new invention called walking in a straight line.
Shut up, bitch!
World War II internment camps. World War II internment camps were camps set up to imprison people with ancestry linked to the countries of the Axis powers in the Second World War. These camps were set up throughout Canada and other allied nations, with people of Japanese, Italian, and German ancestry being taken prisoner to camps because they were accused of being spies for the enemy or helping them in one way or another. In Canada, there were a bunch of these camps set up throughout the provinces. In fact, if you live in Vancouver or British Columbia and know about the PNE, the area there was once a Japanese internment camp. David Suzuki, a famous Japanese-Canadian environmentalist, was interned in one of these camps as a kid, and so were thousands of other innocent people in Canada. Stéphane Molyneux. Stéphane Molyneux is a Canadian podcaster and author who is known for his works in areas of philosophy, politics, and psychology, often discussing topics related to libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, and self-improvement. He rose to fame through his podcast Free Domain Radio, which he started in 2005. The podcast covers a wide range of subjects including ethics, politics, religion, psychology, and personal development. This isn't without controversy, as he's been accused of promoting white nationalist and alt-right ideologies. While he denies this and describes himself as a libertarian, critics point to his associations with individuals and groups known for far-right views. In recent years, Molyneux has been banned from YouTube, Twitter, and other social media platforms due to violations of their policies on hate speech and harassment. Residential schools. Residential schools were a government-sponsored assimilation policy aimed at forcibly assimilating Indigenous children into Anglo-Canadian or French-Canadian culture. They operated from the early 1800s to 1996, when the last residential school was closed in Saskatchewan. The schools were run by various Christian churches, primarily Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and United churches. The purpose of the schools was to separate Indigenous children from their families, communities, and cultural heritage, with the goal of eradicating Indigenous languages, cultures, and traditional ways of life. Conditions in these schools were often harsh and abusing, and the experiences of children who attended them were marked by physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and loss of identity. Schools were often underfunded, overcrowded, and suffered inadequate sanitation and nutrition. Students were often punished for practicing cultural traditions and were forbidden from speaking their native languages. In recent times, the federal government has acknowledged the harmful effects of the residential school system and apologized, with efforts being made to compensate survivors and promote reconciliation. Social Credit Party. The Social Credit Party, or SOCREDS, was a political party established in 1935 and participated in every election until 1988 and was later dissolved in 1995. The party was formed around the social credit economic theories of C.H. Douglas, which went a little along the lines of this. More money was to be put into the economy, allowing people to have more purchasing power, and in turn this would stimulate economic activity and ensure that all goods and services produced can be bought and consumed. Seems confusing? Well, it was. Overall, the party was socially conservative in all other aspects other than the economy. Their greatest success came in the election in 1962 when the party managed to win 30 seats, the most in its history. The SOCREDS were also pretty controversial. The party had anti-Semitic, anti-gay marriage, and pro-life views. As of today, the Social Credit Party is non-existent, and its influence in the Canadian political scene has completely vanished. Attempts have been made to revive the party, but they've been unsuccessful. Cam McLeod and Briar Schmigelski. Cam McLeod and Briar Schmigelski were two young men from Port Alberni, British Columbia, who embarked on a road trip across Canada in 2019. On their trip, while they were in northern BC, they murdered Australian Lucas Fowler and his American girlfriend China Deese, as well as a local man named Leonard Dick. Soon after, McLeod and Schmigelski were reported missing, and their truck was found burned in a remote area of northern BC, with the two men being declared suspects in the murders of Fowler, Deese, and Dick. A manhunt spanning several provinces ensued, involving a massive police effort and captured widespread media attention. The search lasted for weeks and covered vast rugged terrains, including dense forests and difficult to access areas. Ultimately, McLeod and Schmigelski were found dead in northern Manitoba, approximately 3,000 kilometers east of where the initial murders occurred. The deaths were determined to be suicides, and the case raised discussions around mental health, youth violence, and the impact of social media on crime investigations. 1885 Immigration Act. The 1885 Canadian Immigration Act was a piece of legislation enacted by the Canadian government that significantly restricted immigration from China. The act consisted of 3 provisions. They were the head tax, which was a $50 tax imposed on every Chinese person entering Canada. This tax would rise to $100 in 1900 and to $500 in 1903. Exclusion of Chinese laborers, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese workers to Canada. However, there were exceptions for merchants, diplomats, students, and individuals with specialized skills. And the Chinese Certificate of Registration, which was meant for Chinese immigrants who entered Canada before the 1885 Act. They would have to receive a certificate that proved their legal status in Canada, and failure to do this would result in deportation. Cai Chi-lop. Cai Chi-lop is a Chinese-born Canadian who has been described as one of the world's most notorious drug traffickers. He is believed to be the leader of an international crime syndicate known as Sam Gore, which is involved in the production and distribution of illegal drugs across Asia and beyond. In 2021, he was arrested in the Netherlands at the request of Australia, who had been investigating his drug trafficking activities for years. Alec Minassian. Alec Minassian is the man who perpetrated the Toronto van attack on April 23, 2018, resulting in 10 deaths and 16 injuries. Minassian drove a rental van onto a crowded sidewalk in the North York area of Toronto, intentionally striking pedestrians. Minassian claimed his reasoning behind the attack was because of the lack of attention he got from women. After his arrest, he was on trial and his defense team argued he shouldn't be held criminally responsible because of his autism. Despite this, Minassian was found guilty in March 2021 and sentenced to life in prison. Ken and Barbie Killers. Ken and Barbie Killers is a nickname given to serial killer couple Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, who were convicted of the rape and murder of 3 young women in the 1990s. The couple began a relationship in 1987 and later became known for their violent sexual acts, which included the abduction, rape, and murder of 3 young women, Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka, Carla's own sister. Bernardo was arrested in 1993 after police discovered evidence linking him to the murders. Meanwhile, Carla claimed she was a victim of Paul's abuse and had been forced to participate in the crimes. However, evidence also suggested Homolka was an active participant in the murders, resulting in her getting 12 years in prison. Since she cooperated with police, she didn't get the maximum life sentence. Paul Bernardo, on the other hand, received the maximum life sentence for the murders. However, in recent times, there has been controversy surrounding the current Canadian government for considering transferring Bernardo from a maximum security prison to a minimum security prison. FLQ. The Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ for short, was a militant Quebec separatist group which aimed to establish an independent and communist Quebec through violent means. They were recognized as a terrorist group by the Canadian government and were responsible for over 160 violent incidences from 1963 to 1970, killing a total of 8 people and injuring many more. The FLQ was known for its bombings, specifically the bombings of banks, police stations, military facilities, government buildings, and mailbox bombings. A notable attack of theirs was the Montreal Stock Exchange bombing in 1969, and later the kidnapping of British Trade Commissioner James Cross, which led to the October Crisis in 1970, along with the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. A federal crackdown ended the October Crisis and resulted in a massive loss of popularity for the FLQ, with a few of their members being granted refuge in Cuba while others were arrested and charged. Quebec City shooting. This entry refers to a mosque shooting that took place on January 29, 2017 in Quebec City. The shooting was done by Alexander Bissonnette, a white supremacist and Islamophobe with ties to the far right, who was motivated by Canada's large intake of refugees and immigrants. On the evening of January 29th, Bissonnette entered the mosque and opened fire on people. Bissonnette killed a total of 6 people, injuring 19 others before fleeing the scene, but later surrendering to the police and being given a maximum life sentence in prison. William Leon Mackenzie King and his occultism. This entry refers to William Leon Mackenzie King, one of Canada's most famous prime ministers. Specifically, it's referring to how he would use a Ouija board to contact his dead mother and speak with her in the afterlife. Ford family. The Ford family is a very famous Canadian political family. It has many notable members who have been involved in politics in Ontario, starting with Doug Ford Sr. serving as provincial member of parliament before his sons Rob Ford and Doug Ford got involved in Ontario provincial politics, with Rob Ford serving as the mayor of Toronto and Doug Ford serving as the current premier of Ontario. This isn't without controversy, as Doug Ford is alleged to have been a drug dealer when he was young, and Rob Ford was a crack smoker, and was even recorded smoking crack while serving as mayor of Toronto. Wavy Websurf made an interesting video about this. I recommend you check it out. Renata Ford, the wife of Rob Ford, is also said to be friends with many high-profile Canadian neo-Nazis, but this hasn't been proven and is only a rumor. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton is an infamous Canadian serial killer who killed up to 49 women in British Columbia during the 1980s to early 2000s. He would go to Vancouver's downtown east side, which is known for its poverty, open drug use, and prostitution, and lure women to his car with money or drugs, and afterwards he'd drive them back to his farm in Port Coquitlam before murdering them. It is reported that up to 65 women went missing, but because they were junkies and prostitutes, their disappearances went unnoticed, and bodies weren't found, leading police to refuse to act, and for the longest time, police refused to say there was a serial killer at work. Perhaps the most disgusting part is that Pickton would hide the bodies by feeding his victims' corpses to the pigs on his farm. After more and more women began disappearing from the downtown's east side, calls were made for the police to act, but they couldn't exactly do much and didn't know who was abducting the women. Police had reason to suspect Pickton because of his frequent trips to the downtown's east side, but couldn't search him or his farm due to lack of evidence and the lack of a search warrant. However, police would investigate Pickton's farm after the authorities were notified about potentially illegally owned firearms. While searching, the police would find women's clothes, shoes, jewelry, and an asthma inhaler that belonged to one of the missing women. As a result, Pickton was arrested and a total of 26 murder charges were laid against him, but he was only charged with 6. While detained in jail, Pickton would confess to an undercover RCMP officer who'd been placed as his cellmate that he murdered 49 women and wanted to make it 50. This was the largest criminal investigation and crime scene in Canadian history, with the RCMP taking over 200,000 DNA samples from Pickton's farm and digging up to 292,824 cubic meters of soil in search of human remains. It's important to note that many of Pickton's victims and missing women were Indigenous, and the case focused public attention on the wider issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In case any of y'all are interested as to what the farm looked like, you can actually visit the place in Port Coquitlam. Just be careful in case Pickton comes back and you become his next victim. Colonel Russell Williams. Colonel Russell Williams is a serial rapist and murderer and former Canadian Air Force colonel. Williams joined the Air Force in 1987 and rose through the ranks. He served in the war in Afghanistan and was the wing commander at CFB Trenton, Canada's busiest military airbase. He was regarded as a model military officer and flew many famous people such as Queen Elizabeth II, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Governor-General of Canada, and the Prime Minister of Canada in VIP aircraft. In 2010, Ontario woman Jessica Lloyd disappeared from her home. Later, it was revealed that Williams was responsible for the disappearance and murder when he confessed his role in multiple crimes including sexual assaults and breaking and entering to the Ontario Provincial Police. He also confessed to killing Corporal Mary France Comeau, a Canadian Forces flight attendant. The most disturbing thing is that he would dress in women's clothing and break into people's houses to steal women's clothes and sex toys, as well as sexually assault individuals in the house he had broken into. Khader family detainings. The Khader family is an Egyptian-Canadian family who has ties to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In the 2000s, Khader family members were captured and detained in Guantanamo Bay detention camp. This was because it was uncovered that the family had connections to the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda and had even received training by Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. What's interesting is that Omar Khader, a detained member of the Khader family, successfully sued the Canadian government for over $10 million in compensation for human rights violations. Adrian Arcand and W.J. Beatty. This entry refers to Adrian Arcand, a Canadian fascist and neo-Nazi who dubbed himself the Canadian Fuhrer. Arcand created and led the National Unity Party, a fascist political party that took lots of inspiration from both Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler's versions of fascism. Covertly, the party received money from the Conservative Party and former Prime Minister R.B. Bennett during the 1920s and 30s. Following their outbreak of World War II in 1939, a year later in 1940, Arcand was arrested and detained in an internment camp. While in the internment camp, he would sit on a throne made by other prisoners and talk about what he'd do once Hitler conquers Canada. After the war, Arcand ran for parliament twice, finishing in second place each time. After Arcand died in the 1960s, leadership was passed to W.J. Beatty, a neo-Nazi who led the National Unity Party during the 1960s and 70s. Bruce McArthur. Bruce McArthur is another Canadian serial killer from the Toronto area. Between 2010 and 2017, McArthur targeted gay men and immigrant men. He'd lure them for sexual encounters before killing them afterwards, with his victims' age ranging between 37 and 58 years old. When human remains were discovered in planters on various properties McArthur worked on as a landscaper, McArthur was arrested in January 2018, pleading guilty to all 8 counts of murder. He is currently serving a life in prison sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Walter Davy Cohen. Walter Davy Cohen was a Canadian politician who served as the mayor of Regina and as member of parliament during the 1910s and 20s. After he briefly took a break from politics in the 1920s, he came back to the House of Commons in the 1930 federal election, becoming a Conservative Member of Parliament. This is also when people found out that while serving as a Member of Parliament and being in public office, Cohen was also the provincial treasurer for the KKK's Canada branch. The CIA deliberately disrupted the Avro Arrow. This one is more of a conspiracy theory. This entry refers to the cancellation of the Avro Arrow, a Canadian jet interceptor that was the fastest and most advanced for its time during the late 1950s and early 1960s. The interceptor was in its prototype stage when it was cancelled by then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. This led to many to believe that the CIA pressured the Prime Minister to cancel the project and instead focus on buying American products. But in my own opinion, seeing that Diefenbaker wasn't the biggest fan of America, and chances are he wouldn't listen to a foreign power he despised, the cancellation of the Avro Arrow project was probably more related to how much it cost rather than foreign pressure. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Canadian asbestos. This entry refers to asbestos that was in many Canadian houses and buildings until the 1990s. Asbestos is responsible for tons of cases of lung disease throughout Canada, and many old houses and buildings still have asbestos in them. Hence why, if you're driving through Canada, you might see a bunch of abandoned structures in various towns and cities. Those structures stand abandoned because of the large amounts of asbestos in them, and it would be costly and risky to remove it and demolish the building. There have been efforts made to compensate people affected by asbestos in Canada, but not much can be done about the structures that still contain lots of asbestos. Kim Campbell was a Liberal Party plant. This entry refers to the 1993 Canadian federal election when former Prime Minister Kim Campbell lost a historic defeat and the Conservative Party ended up with just 2 seats after the election concluded. The Liberal plant refers to a joke that Kim Campbell was secretly a Liberal Party sympathizer or decoy, since most of her policies were progressive compared to previous Conservative Prime Ministers, hence why she lost so badly. Peter Nygard. This entry refers to Canadian fashion designer Peter Nygard, who faces allegations of sexual assault, sex trafficking, and harassment. In 2020, Nygard was arrested by American authorities who charged him with sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, and other crimes related to the mentioned allegations. These allegations against Nygard span several decades and involved dozens of women, many of whom were minors at the time of the incidents. Victims of Nygard claimed that they were lured to parties in which they were drugged and sexually assaulted, as well as being forced to perform various sexual acts. Controversy surrounding Nygard has had consequences, including the bankruptcy and closure of his New York City store. You can even call Peter Nygard Canada's Jeff Epstein, as Nygard owned a private estate on an island in Bermuda where he'd perform his sexual crimes. Rob Ford's lost tapes. This entry refers to the videos of former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford smoking crack. So far, 2 videos have been found, and there's an alleged 3rd tape still out there. The Montreal Experiments. The Montreal Experiments were the CIA's Canadian branch of MKUltra. It took place between 1957 and 1964 and focused on attempting to control people's minds through brainwashing them. The experiments took place in the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University. The doctor working on the experiments deemed he could cure his patients of schizophrenia and depression by simply brainwashing a person who had the condition. Patients in the experiment would be played thousands of pre-recorded messages, be injected with LSD combined with sleep-inducing drugs, be put through electroshock therapy, and experience sensory deprivation. Dr. Donald Cameron, the lead doctor during this experiment, would force patients to listen to specific pre-recorded tapes of himself for 10 days and up to 16 hours a day. These messages would be negative and personal, directed towards the patients, many of whom suffered from schizophrenia and depression and were promised a cure to their conditions. Afterwards, positive messages would be played for patients for the next 10 days. If anxiety occurred in the patients, they'd be given heavy doses of sedating drugs. It's unknown how many people applied for the experiment, but in 1992, over 300 people applied for the compensation from the Canadian government. Participants often suffered from amnesia after the experiment and had to be taught many basic skills again, with some reports saying that some even had to be potty trained again. The people who suffered from the experiments were severely mentally damaged, and family members of the patients report seeing them sit in a dark room and stare at a wall for hours on end, with some cases of patients writing messages on walls before sitting and staring at them for hours. Very little is known about the Montreal experiments, as Dr. Cameron's records were never found, and all other documents relating to the topic are classified or no longer exist. Most information we know comes from the patients' reports, and especially from their journals or court reports. Ukrainian rat lines after World War II. This entry refers to the Nazi collaborators from Ukraine who escaped to Canada after the Second World War. These Ukrainians range from high-profile war criminals to neo-Nazis, all of whom were escaping persecution. In recent times, they made news in 2020 after a Ukrainian memorial for soldiers who served in the SS Galicia division, which was responsible for the murders of many Jews and Polish women and children during the Second World War, was defaced. Pierre Trudeau's support of apartheid. Like the title says, Pierre Trudeau supported the apartheid regime in South Africa. For those of you who don't know what apartheid was, it was a racist political and social system in South Africa during the period of white minority rule. It enforced racial discrimination against non-whites, mainly focused on skin color and facial features, existing from 1948 to the 1990s. Pierre Trudeau, who's known for being a progressive and liberal-minded politician, supported the system in South Africa and exploited the cheap black labor from the country. And keep in mind, black people in South Africa were treated much worse and paid far less compared to white South Africans during the apartheid regime. Throughout his prime ministership, Pierre Trudeau allowed Canadian companies to be heavily invested in South Africa, while also helping the South African regime get economic assistance from the IMF in the 1980s. Officially, Pierre Trudeau supported the arms embargo against South Africa, but never enforced it, and as late as 1978, Canadian weapons continued to be shipped to South Africa. Forced sterilization. This entry refers to the laws in Canadian provinces, particularly in British Columbia and Alberta, that had laws which allowed forced sterilization of Indigenous women. Forced sterilization occurred from the 1930s to approximately the 1970s. However, there are still reports of forced sterilization of Indigenous women throughout Canada, and the issue is still present in Canadian society. In 2017, 60 women from Saskatchewan sued their provincial government, claiming they had been forced to accept sterilization before seeing their newborns. The lawsuit helped more Indigenous women around Canada come forward and say they were also forcefully sterilized even after the forced sterilization laws were repealed. Helmut Oberlander. The last entry refers to a Nazi death squad interpreter named Helmut Oberlander. Oberlander was born in a German family living in Ukraine during the time of the Soviet Union in 1924. During the Second World War, Oberlander served as an interpreter and collaborated with the Einsatzgruppen, a division in the SS that's credited with murdering up to 2 million people, most of whom were civilians and Jews. In 1954, Oberlander immigrated to Canada with his wife, and it was also in 1954 where it was discovered he'd been a Nazi interpreter. Immediately, the RCMP started investigating him, but they couldn't find concrete evidence that showed that he was actually responsible for war crimes or crimes against humanity like other Nazi collaborators were. On April 28, 1995, Oberlander was faced with deportation for his past crimes. However, he fled to Florida where he owned a condo. Despite being in another country, authorities showed up at his door and threatened him with deportation, and Oberlander went back to Canada but wasn't deported. In 2000, a judge concluded Oberlander wasn't involved in any war crimes or crimes against humanity. However, in 2008, the government revoked Oberlander's Canadian citizenship, but in 2009, the Federal Appeals Court gave citizenship back to him. This was after Oberlander took his case to the Federal Appeals Court and claimed that citizenship had been unfairly taken from him and won his case. In 2012 again, Oberlander was stripped of his citizenship, and in 2015, Oberlander appealed the decision again, only this time, a year later in 2016, his appeal was rejected. In 2020, Oberlander filed another appeal and lost. He now moved to a deportation hearing, and in 2021, the federal government dismissed Oberlander's lawyers' attempts to halt the deportation proceedings. It all looked like Oberlander would be being deported to Germany because he once had German citizenship, and if he were, he would be tried for being an auxiliary due to German laws changing in 1990s and now prosecuting former accomplices in Nazi war crimes. However, in September of 2021, Oberlander died in his home in Waterloo before a potential deportation at the age of 97. And that, my friends, sums up the Canadian iceberg. From the tip to the abyss, I went over everything on the list, and I'm a poet and I didn't even know it. Some things were pretty clear, whereas other areas required more of an explanation. If you like what you saw and managed to reach the end, consider subscribing and liking the video. Or don't, I can't force you. Anyways, see ya.